What historical fact did you learn in school that later turned out to be completely wrong or misrepresented? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. Sorcery Yuri Firm 1. In 7th grade, my geography teacher taught us that China had such a big population because of the Asian monsoons, which basically means the rain season. Didn't get it. As my teacher explained, China had a big population because, due to the rain, couples would stay inside more, get bored, and to pass the time, leading to more children being born. She even asked this in a test. Story 2. 5th grade, 1990. Teacher tells the class, all of the Central American countries are Spanish-speaking. My aunt had just returned from Belize, and I rose my hand and said, Belize is officially English-speaking. Teacher says, no, they are all Spanish. Story 3. I told my son who was studying about a country's history, and the teacher sent a homework about one of their castles saying it was from the 9th century and that it had remained like that always, and it was on the history book too. I learned that also when I was a kid, some years after I went there from Norway. I talked with my son, went to the digital archive of the municipality, and downloaded tons of photos that shown the castle's walls were indeed ancient, but that the castle as is was built in 1946, according to what the dictatorship of the time decided a medieval castle should look like. He was baffled and was totally unaware of that. My kid was put aside by that teacher who, despite me showing him the photos, privately took it as an offense. Story 4. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere rode approximately 20 miles from Boston to Lincoln, MA, on April 18, 1775, to warn of approaching British troops before being intercepted by a British Army patrol. It was actually Israel Bissell who continued the journey from Watertown, MA, to Philadelphia, 345 km, on the morning of April 19th to alert the Continental Congress. His message resulted in more than 50,000 armed troops being mobilized to Boston to meet the British invasion. Story 5. Who else here was raised in the 80s, where the food pyramid was drilled into your head? I've known longer that it's hogwash than I lived with it, but I still can't get it out of my head, and my subconscious will always think that's the appropriate way of meal planning. Story 6. Taste buds. I vividly remember a textbook saying that since we had the soft spot at the tip of the tongue, we liked licking ice creams, and 7-year-old me obviously believed this piece of collective knowledge because obviously a book had to be right. Story 7. Lot of Columbus hate in here, and for good reason. But I'd just like to add that the impression I got in school was that the Native Americans were all these incredibly peaceful, pipe-smoking hippies who shared the land and just wanted to beat their drums and grow corn. It turns out they were unbelievably violent to one another and often stole each other's land. But that doesn't make what Columbus did right. Nope, it sure doesn't. Story 8. That the Pilgrims came over to America for religious freedom, painted them as these kind of progressive liberal Christians, and across the pond was too stifling and controlling. No, not the full story. Pilgrims came over here because they wanted to be religious wackadoos. Story 9. Peaceful negotiation only happens after a long period of violence and unrest until the colonialists find themselves on the losing end. Ain't nobody going to give up a piece of land after being asked nicely. School history books tends to make the war and the peace negotiation as two separate, unrelated events. Story 10. Helen Keller is spun as part of a right-wing narrative of individualism and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. What they don't tell you is she went on to dedicate her life to fighting for civil rights and was a very outspoken socialist. Story 11. I remember doing something in primary school, about 7 and 8-year-old, on explorers. This included that Columbus was European in America and that Captain Cook discovered Australia. Being a weird dork, I knew that Vikings reached North America and Abel Tasman reached Australia first. My teacher refused to accept this was right, and I distinctly remember that being the point when I realized not all adults were clever. Story 12. Christopher Columbus discovering America. He didn't and was vile. George Washington's teeth being made out of wood. It wasn't. It was slaves' teeth. The crazy fact that Nelson Mandela was seen in a positive light, but he was actually a designated terrorist by America. America going to fight terrorists in the Middle East because our greatest ally said there was weapons of mass destruction. There wasn't. Our constitutional rights cannot be taken away by our government. Look at what's happening today. Story 13. That when John F. Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," he was unintentionally saying, "I am a donut." This was a rumor that came about 2 decades later, but it became so widely accepted, that we were told this at school. Nobody listening to the speech would have interpreted it this way. Story 14. That Ontario was founded by respectable, hard-working, loyal British subject who lived by high moral standards. They came here to build a better life, more independent than Britain, but not as unstable and uncultured as the United States. That is sort of true. A lot of people coming here had a very British sense of propriety and Christian values, but there was also a lot of whiskey, violence, prostitution, domestic violence, and random pregnancies. Story 15. Sojourner Truth's famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech never happened, at least not the way it's presented. She was actually born and raised in New York and spoke Dutch as her first language as well as English. She did give a speech at a women's rights convention in Ohio, but not the one everybody thinks she gave. Some years later, a white abolitionist thought the speech would have more punch to it if it had been given in Southern black slave dialect, and so rewrote it into the form everybody's familiar with. Arguably, she was right, since nobody knows the original version. Story 16. No one knows what happened to the Roanoke colony or during Custer's last stand. Yes, we do. The survivors of Roanoke left a note on the stump and went to live with the Croatan people instead of on Croatan Island. And the Sioux have their own accounts of Custer's last stand. They don't make Custer look good, or the U.S. Army at that time. Story 17. When I was an exchange student in the USA, my moron of a history teacher got into an argument stating that the USA provided military aid to Hungary in 1956 in our revolution against the Soviets, and I couldn't convince him that it's factually untrue. Guy's previous job was sewing footballs. Yeah, I don't wonder why Americans are stupid. Story 18. The Puritans fled religious persecution to come to the New World. No, they didn't. They were in charge of the entire country, and people hated them so much that they opted to bring back monarchy rather than live under puritanical rule. The Puritans fled, not being allowed to force their beliefs on everyone else anymore. Story 19, basically anything about native North America. When I was a kid, we were taught that there were very few native people in North America. Turns out that was halfway between a self-serving lie and straight ignorance. There were likely 100 million people over the Americas in 1491, but 100 years later dropped to 5 to 6. Also, the Bering Land Bridge theory. Story 20. The whole Betsy Ross story pisses me off. The story didn't come out until a century later during the planning for the centennial. Someone wondered who sewed the first flag, and her grandson said, "Oh, that was my grandma." So now it's a whole thing to start remembering Betsy Ross. There isn't even any evidence she sewed any flags at all. She made clothes. In Philadelphia, we have the Betsy Ross house, but there is no evidence it is where she ever lived. It is possible that she lived in the house next door, but that was torn down in the 1950s, as it was in such poor condition that it was deemed a fire hazard. But they made a beautiful little courtyard there. During the ramp up to the bicentennial, it was decided that they should relocate her body to the courtyard so everyone can pay their respects. Out they go to the cemetery to dig her up. Now, it should be noted that this burial plot isn't even her first plot. She was originally buried in the city, but was moved to the outskirts when they wanted to build more houses. So they go to her marker and dig. No body. Whatever shall they do? They just start digging around until they find a coffin with female bones. The anthropologist in charge said, "There's no question about this one. All indications point to this one." It was a great distance away from the grave marker, but it was put up in 1923, and that's 70 years after she was moved to the cemetery. To make it even better, they didn't find a full skeleton. There was a male leg bone, deemed to be her husband's, and a portion of a female skull, but the plot they were digging in also contained 4 other people. So it is likely that the bones buried in the grave of Betsy Ross and John Claypool are actually those of Susan Sellers, Clarissa Wilson, Sarah Wilson, or Jacob Wilson. Story 21. My history teacher in 7th grade made a big deal how slavery was not the main cause of the Civil War. She spent a week making us do an assignment, going over what the main cause actually was. Her point being that slavery was a smaller issue that stemmed from a bigger issue, which was states' rights, which I suppose in a weird way is correct, but it was how they wanted their rights to be handled around slavery. Story 22, that slaves built the Egyptian pyramids. Apparently that was a common myth that has been believed for centuries, even during the time of ancient Greece. Modern technology and excavations have revealed that the builders were a combination of foreign labor, farmers moving inland for the flood season, and skilled laborers. Story 23. My teacher in middle school taught us that the seasons are due to the earth being closer to the sun in the summer and further from the sun in the winter. I have had a large number of people on Reddit argue with me on this one, so before you decide to argue this, please look it up. The change in the seasons are not caused by the Earth's distance to the sun. They are caused by the tilt of the Earth on its axis as it travels around the sun. Story 24. Not in school, but when I was younger, I'd always heard that the Greeks invented the orgy and the Romans added women. I always imagined that Romans were orgy-loving hedonists. Then I grew up and read about Romans' history for myself and realized that they were honor-bound conservatives who considered self-control one of the highest virtues. Claiming that a senator or emperor was having orgies was an attack of their moral character as one in the grips of vice. Story 25. Not me, but my daughter. She has epilepsy, so we bought her an epilepsy watch, which calls us if she has a seizure, and installed a family GPS tracker on her phone so we know where she is. She had a school lesson on healthy relationships, and her teacher told her that sharing your live location with anyone, no matter their reasoning, is toxic and controlling. My daughter tried to justify it and was still told that she shouldn't have the app on her phone and that she is being controlled. I get that technology can lend itself to abuse, but her teacher's attitude is extremely narrow-minded and dangerous. Not necessarily a historical fact, but it is a slow-developing overcorrection from schools in the face of social media and technology that will be a talking point in the future. Story 26, Middle School Social Studies. We learned that the Mayan just up and disappeared, and no one knows where they went. I remember telling my teacher that my family were descended in part from the Mayans and that a lot of people still lived there. She just laughed like it was BS. Story 27. The story about the woman who sued McDee's after spilling the lava-hot coffee taught to us as an example of a frivolous lawsuit. McDee's kept their coffee at that ridiculous temp because they could keep it for longer, reducing waste. At reasonable temps, they have to make a fresh batch more often. She had third-degree burns, was hospitalized for 8 days, required skin grafts, was permanently scarred, and yet initially sued for her medical costs only. Story 28. As a survivor or a rural Missouri public school, I think it would be easier to list what they got right, LMAO. Civil War was not about states' rights. There's kind of a lot of missing info from that statement. The atrocities surrounding anything about the civil rights movement and slavery were heavily downplayed. It was not, in fact, just a few outlier incidents. There actually isn't such a thing as a good slave owner, anything about Christopher Columbus, anything about American indigenous people, anything about non-white, non-English people TBH, sorry to Scandinavian, Irish, and Scottish people. You were still Vikings and barbarians. Pretty sure I didn't know people in third world countries had cars and electricity and stuff until I was in, high school. I was definitely led to believe everyone was living in huts still and living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, wearing loincloths and like Tarzan. Story 29. Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, wasn't the day America became independent. That was when we declared our desire for independence and started the War of Independence. We didn't become a free nation until the British surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. Why we celebrate the former and not the latter is a mystery only America can explain. Story 30. I was taught that the U.S. was the only free country in the world. I was in maybe 4th or 5th grade when we had a babysitter that was a foreign exchange student from Germany. He asked me if I thought I would want to visit Germany someday, and I said, no, absolutely not. Why? No freedom. The guy almost fell out of his chair laughing. He said that Germany has more freedom than the U.S. There is no drinking age. The Autobahn doesn't have a speed limit, and rattled off a few others. It was at that very moment I realized I had been fed pro-America propaganda my whole life. Story 31, right up on 1861 Corwin Amendment that Lincoln endorsed, would have been 13th Amendment that protected slavery from federal abolition and was Lincoln's way to try and preserve the Union. Definitely goes against the mainstream portrayal of Lincoln as this great emancipator. He would have kept slavery as long as it kept the Union together. Story 32. That states' rights was the main cause of the Civil War in the U.S. A student stood up to argue that it was really because of slavery, and he was almost sent to the principal's office. For context, he was a straight-A student, never got in any major trouble. History teacher responded by saying that if we want to get the answer correct on the test, we need to put states' rights as the answer. This was in Texas. Story 33. That the so-called American founding fathers are to be unquestionably honored and respected. Americans seem to have forgotten their origins. The founding fathers were a bunch of aristocratic slave-owning white men who thought all are created equally, except if you didn't own property, poor, or if you had internal reproductive organs, women, Or if you had pigment in your skin, blacks. The very fucking foundation of the USA was a bunch of white dudes exploiting others via slavery and oppression, all for their personal profit. Even the Northern founding fathers had household servants, which were pretty much slaves, a distinction without much of a difference. And more so, they permitted slavery and exploitation to continue even if they didn't directly participate. They indirectly benefited from it as it met their political and economic goals. So don't you dare give them a free pass. Never forget this when you see the U.S. flag. Hear someone recite the pledge, see someone celebrate the 4th of July, or hold any founding father in any sort of esteem. They're all pricks. Story 34. Warning. Catholic faith questioning. Growing up in Catholic elementary and a more open Jesuit high school, it was implied that the Bible is the truth. In high school, one of my religion classes taught that the events of the Bible could have occurred in history, with other evidence beyond the Bible to support it, but in a more realistic manner, and not just fueled by impossible acts. Someone in Israel named Jesus probably did exist around 0 AD, but was probably more of a rebellious leader who did a lot of good than a son of an omnipotent being. Story 35. In Denmark, we are typically taught in school that Copenhagen was founded by Bishop Absalon in 1167 when he constructed a fortress here. I think most people interested in history have always known it's a little bit of a white lie. There's evidence of a church, farms, and recent evidence even suggests ruins of a prior fortress on the location in which Absalon constructed his fortress. Story 36. Incorrect lift theory. It's actually in lots of science books. The theory is that lift is created by the Bernoulli effect. The surface of a wing is curved on top and flat on bottom, so the air's route over the top of the wing to the back is longer than the route over the bottom, so it has to travel faster. By Bernoulli's principle, the pressure on the top of the wing is then less because of the faster movement, creating lift. Just one problem. Nobody told the air on the top of the wing it's in a race with the air on the bottom of the wing. Lift is created because the air going across the top is then directed down. The reason it gets stated so much is because it's a tiny bit correct. The air on the top does travel a bit faster, creating a tiny bit less pressure, but it's negligible, and there are airfoils that have equal paths that work fine. Story 37. The Revolutionary War was not fought primarily because of taxes and representation. The primary reason for it was because the wealthy landowners in power were not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains because of British treaties with the natives, and they felt it was their right to settle there and make money dollars. Ever wonder why most of the founding fathers were wealthy old money slave plantation owners? Taxes and tariffs were a side benefit, but they more importantly were an easy way to convince the common folk to fight back. Even today, Americans froth at the mouth at the mention of taxes. But as we saw, the new U.S. government began taxing as well. So the common people saw very little difference in their day-to-day after the war, whereas the wealthy now has the entire new world to exploit as they saw fit. Story 38. Basically everything to do with the first peoples of Australia and the pioneers. The colonial population were described as adventurous heroes conquering the difficult wilds of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, like the Wild West. Phony deals between Aboriginal people and the colonizers, like the Lord Melbourne Treaty. Terra nullius was in the background, rather than at the forefront of describing the genocide that was the reality. I didn't even read about the stolen generation until high school. Terra nullius was a term falsely used to describe the land of Terra Australis as free of civilization. Literally, land with no master. This allowed the colonizers to legally acquire the land as uninhabited. The Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders, which are not a homogeneous people but in fact hundreds of nations with distinct languages, cultures, and even look different, Australia is a big place, were erroneously described as solely nomadic with no permanent structures of agriculture. Evidence shows signs of more permanent structures, including stone buildings, agriculture, conveniently destroyed by the colonizers. As such evidence would make it impossible to declare the land terra nullius. Understand that my understanding of this topic is not academic and is only from my own reading, and the above is general in nature. I'm a white fella and defer to anyone black or white who can tell the story better. Story 39. Well, this is omission of fact rather than misinformation. In the Protestant majority schools I attended in Northern Ireland, we didn't learn anything about local or recent Irish history. With the exception of Viking, Egyptian, Roman, Greek, and a very small amount of Celtic history taught in primary school, ages 5-11, everything else was Anglo-centric. Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII, the Normans, Tudors, World Wars, etc. It's astounding to me that we were never taught about the potato famine, British rule over Ireland, the Easter Rising, the partition of Ireland, and establishment of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, the Troubles, etc. Anything that could be perceived as contentious was just completely omitted. When it came to religious education as well, we learn about Christianity from a largely Protestant perspective, including its origins in Lutheranism. We were briefly taught about what Catholic people believed, much to the resentment of a few bigoted classmates from staunchly British loyalist families. Judaism was also included, but absolutely nothing else about other world religions. 90% of schools in Northern Ireland are still segregated due to religious grounds. Story 40. That Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. Bitch, that Mfair was a murder hobo who thought the world was pear-shaped and that he landed in India. On top of that, there were already people here. How do you claim to have discovered a new land when there are already people there? Also, he was just a bastard in general. He had a deal with his crew that whomever saw land first would get a fat bonus. When one of the crew saw land, he told old Christopher. Columbus then said, "No, I totally saw that hours ago," and proceeded to give himself the bonus he promised his crew. So on top of the raping, pillaging, plundering he did up and down Central America, he was just a true POS through and through. He also never stepped 1 foot or even saw North America. That is an outright fabrication. Story 41. After reading the primary documents, we really don't know that much about Columbus. He was an inattentive governor under whom the Spaniards committed atrocities under, but he also swiftly punished them for, with some accounts contradicting each other, all muddied by the fact the Spaniards hated him for being a Northern Italian during a time Spain saw itself as a scrappy backwater. Is he a hero? Nah. Was he a genocidal tyrant? Nah. Was he good dude? Hell if I know. But the 2 governors after him sure sucked, and he gets blamed for their actions. That's the difference between learning a shocking fact in high school based on secondary sources and reading the primary sources yourself in college. Sometimes you just don't get a very clear picture despite all the narratives that have been conjured. Edit. If you're looking for the undeniable bad guys we do have documentation on, it was Bobadilla and Deovando who cataloged their atrocities on native populations. Columbus, on the other hand, got slandered by Spaniards who didn't want to pay a man from the rich land of Genoa or were directly gunning for his job. The British also slandered Columbus because they saw him as part of Spanish imperialism, so obviously the Brits took exception to a lesser empire's savagery compared to their oh-so-pleasant rule. Does this make Columbus a good guy? No, he wasn't a very effectual leader, what with him leaving all the time. He was essentially AFK during his governorship. It should also be added that later writings by De las Casas excoriated Columbus because De las Casas was anti-imperialist, and he saw Spanish colonialism as being precipitated by Columbus's discovery of the New World. One account had Columbus's atrocities listed as not being against the natives, but rather the use of the death penalty on Spaniards for harassment of the natives. Of course, that harassment occurred due largely in part to Columbus's own absence. Real scholarship is frustrated by the fact that some of the sources for Bobadillas are locked away in a vault in Spain somewhere. Story 42. I was originally taught the natives and European settlers got along very well. It was also presented that Columbus was Spanish, he was Italian. I think he was funded by Spain, but that's not what we were taught in elementary school. The transatlantic slave trade was couched to be started by the colonies. It was started by Portugal. In school, they made the Europeans out to just be trading partners who hopped on later. You have a permanent record, and every mistake you make will go in it. Story 43. Why did our U.S. history teachers seemingly never offer context about the George Washington cherry tree story? I understand it was part of the curriculum, so they had to teach it. However, I don't recall them ever using it as a teaching moment to show how history gets misremembered, while still emphasizing that Washington was a decent guy. For so long it was taught as fact when it was really just a myth meant to highlight his character. They could have framed it that way, pairing the famous quote, "Father, I cannot tell a lie, I cut the tree," with a discussion on how legends shape historical perception. Story 44. I remember briefly learning about Stonewalling College, 1618 in the UK, and about how it started when Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick. In reality, Marsha never claimed to have thrown the brick, and by her own admission wasn't even present when the riot started. Sylvia Rivera claimed to have thrown the first brick, something Marsha also disputed since they were at a party elsewhere in the city. In reality, nobody knows who threw the first brick. We know the riot started because a woman got arrested, but while we have a good idea of who it was, Storm Lavery, it's also not 100%. But guaranteed, every time Pride Month rolls around, people will credit the entire modern Pride movement to Marcia, a woman who never claimed, sought out, or wanted credit for it. In reality, it was some person who never got credit and likely never wanted it. And yet people will put Marcia on a pedestal. Marcia was an icon and absolutely deserves credit for all the wonderful work she did for the community. But we shouldn't give her credit she never asked for something that by her own admission she didn't do. All it does is reduce an act of disobedience from hundreds of people to a few key actors and treat who knows how many people from various gender identities and dualities as nothing but background players. Story 45. When we were learning about how America came to be and how Columbus was sailing the ocean, we didn't learn all the sleazy stuff that he did, and it was really glossed over, like, yeah, he did some pillaging, but people mostly died because of being exposed to disease from European people. Now, I know that that's a little bit true of that can happen, but they killed so many people by more of a slaughter force than anything, and Columbus lied about getting more money to stay in the Americas. Also, Thanksgiving was a really messed up celebration that I do not partake in anymore. So basically, learning about America from American schools is not, it is so sugar-coated. Story 46. The entire narrative that indigenous peoples were a peaceful group in tune with nature, using every part of the buffalo out of pure respect for life, etc. The reality being that they had plenty of tribal warfare, slavery, killed massive numbers of animals by running herds off cliffs and only using a fraction of the killed animals, and overall weren't anything near the mystique they taught us. Story 47. Pretty much everything about Thanksgiving and European indigenous American relations. Grade school made it sound like the indigenous peoples of America welcomed Europeans with open arms. They ate and laughed together, and then everyone clapped. Of course, in college, I learned the fucked up truth about how Europeans raped and pillaged and enslaved the indigenous people and decimated the population through smallpox, yearly transmitted diseases, slavery, murder, and warfare. Europeans formed and then violated countless treaties whenever it suited them, making massive land grabs and causing untold suffering, such as in the Trail of Tears. Story 48. The Puritans left England and came to America because of religious intolerance and persecution. They let us fill in the gaps, and as children we assumed that the Puritans were being persecuted. Learn any amount of history about that movement, and it becomes clear that the opposite is true. The Puritans were kicked out of England because they were religiously intolerant of literally everyone else. They can barely coexist with our secular society, and still to this day spend way too much of their time telling other people that their religion says you are bad if you aren't the same type of shame-riddled, hypocritical, hypercritical, conformist assholes that they are. Story 49. The Pilgrims left England for religious persecution. No, they support a failed coup and went to Denmark to escape consequences. They lived in Denmark for about a decade and then hired passage aboard the Mayflower to come to America. Also, the Mayflower was going there with or without the Pilgrims because it was a company ship on a logging expedition, and the Pilgrims made up less than half the people aboard. Story 50. In school, I was always taught that early human societies had a strict division of labor. Men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. It was presented as a simple fact, like that's just the way things were. But as I got older and started reading more, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Recent archaeological discoveries show that women also hunted, sometimes even participating in big game hunts. In some societies, hunting may have been based more on skill and necessity rather than strict gender roles. There's evidence of women being buried with hunting tools, which suggests they weren't just sitting on the sidelines while men brought home the meat. It made me realize how much of history gets simplified or even misrepresented to fit certain narratives. The reality is usually way more complex and interesting than the version we're taught in school. Story 51. This was in like 5th grade. But my teacher said that inflation is a thing that just is always expected to happen. To the degree that fractal reserve banking exerts an influence, yes, but no way does that justify money losing so much value decade after decade. You can thank your government and central banking for your hard-earned savings becoming worth less every year. Story 52. In Slovenian schools, there's a fact being taught that Venice stands on Slovenian oaks, that they got most of the wood for supporting Venice in Slovenian forests. Of course, back then, Slovenia wasn't even a developed concept, but the lands and the people became Slovenia later. It's like a thing everyone hears and believes. Fast forward to my years in uni, and we get a professor who works with a historian who actually extensively researched all the trading agreements on lumber for building Venice. And while it's probably possible that a fraction of that lumber was Slovenian, the very vast majority came from Italy. In fact, there isn't a trace of proof that lumber was coming from Slovenia or even that region at all. Forgot what particular region it came from, but it was undeniably Italian and still is. Sad thing is, a couple other professors still use the old wrong info in some of their lectures, more as a fun fact that is not really fun and not really a fact anymore either. Story 53. America didn't want to declare independence. They liked being English citizens. They drafted the Olive Branch Petition in 1775 to try to reconcile with England and avoid war. The king said, "F off, y'all are traitors." There's a great line by Ben Franklin in the John Adams miniseries. Discussing whether we want to declare independence or not is moot. It has already been thrust upon us, or something like that. John Hancock reading The King's Rely is great too, as you see them all realize they've all been branded as traitors and will be hanged regardless. Story 54. The only thing I can think of is the Thanksgiving story. I learned the traditional narrative, which was at best incomplete. I didn't realize that the Wampanoag were actually very familiar with settlers, and that the Mayflower was just one voyage of many dozens to Massachusetts and New England. They were not settling on a virgin plot. It was a village that had already been abandoned, where the natives had several times interacted with, been attacked by, and driven into the sea a few groups of traders. I also was not aware that it was apparently triggered by the Pilgrims firing a bunch of shots in the air to celebrate like my asshole neighbors do, resulting in a bunch of Wampanoag men rushing into the camp thinking the Europeans were getting massacred by their enemies. Story 55. The Americans spent millions of taxpayer money inventing a pen that would work in zero gravity, while the Soviets just used a pencil. Bic did develop a zero-gravity pen, but it was a private company using their own funds. NASA spent about $7 a pen. The Soviets even developed their own after the pencil shavings and graphite crumbs floating in a sealed, zero-gravity capsule proved to be hazardous to the equipment inside. Story 56. I grew up Christian and went to Catholic schools. While I was taught some things about the history of the church, a lot of it was glossed over. In reality, if you look at the history of the church, it's overwhelmingly corrupt and violent, to the point that it's shocking it's still an active religion. Since the religion's conception, it seems to be mostly used to oppress. At times, it feels like anyone with half a brain should be able to tell that practiced Christianity is antithetical to Jesus' teachings. And yet today, if you bring up what he actually preached, you just get called a socialist, and anything else you say gets instantly ignored. Story 57. Maybe not a fact as such, but we were taught about residential schools here in Canada. Long story very short, these were government-sponsored schools set up by the Catholic Church, which stole Indigenous children away from their families in an attempt to educate and assimilate them into our Canadian society. Heavy abuse, thousands of children died. True and pure evil at work. The thing that I was not taught, born in 1990, was that the last one of these residential schools closed in 1996 when I was in grade 1. Like what the... I get that I'm 34 at this point, but that is not that long ago at all. It was always portrayed that, oh, we did a bad thing, but we know better now. It was always shown that this was something that happened a long time ago. No, this was actively happening less than 30 years ago, and when I was in school myself. Story 58, I was told that the 1837 rebellion in Lower Canada was an attempt at independence which was crushed by the British troops. There was no attempt at independence. The governor of the colony stepped down, putting the military commander in charge, and the asshole gave in to paranoid rumors which had been around for 40-plus years that the Canadians were preparing for insurrection, which they weren't. When the members of the majority party refused to surrender to get hanged, he just started shooting and burning his way across Lower Canada, meeting almost no resistance. The English civilians happily joined in. So basically the English slaughtered, pillaged, and raped their way across what would become Quebec for no reason. Quebec nationalists call it a rebellion because the truth is too pathetic. Federalists also call it a rebellion as an act of whitewashing. Story 59, something about the struggle for Macedonia, 1890s to 1908. History school books present Pavlos Melas as a hero trying to liberate our enslaved kin in Macedonia from the barbaric Turks and Bulgarians. He was actually a rich man from Athens, not understanding the situation up in Macedonia. He played the hero and died fairly quickly. History in the Balkans is just prejudices and national myths that don't let us understand the past and move forward. Story 60, the quote, "Jack of all trades, master of none." Later in life, I found the full quote, A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. Short answer is, the quote is situational and needs to be tested as such. Someone with a broad range, like me, can actually help apply multiple scenarios where your knowledge is needed. Not all cases, no, but enough to at least show the important areas. Story 61. It wasn't something I learned, but rather something I almost got into an altercation, verbally, with a substitute teacher about. I was part of the speech and debate team, and we were doing outreach to encourage students to consider taking the class and trying out for the team. So we had scheduled time to give a presentation to various other classrooms. We happened to be in a history classroom for one of them. After the presentation, while others were answering questions, I was only a junior at the time, so it wasn't my job to answer the questions. I noticed that the classroom had a small laminated poster on the wall talking about the city of Troy. I leaned over to the teacher, who was also at the side of the room waiting for the Q&A to end, and said, "Man, hard to believe that we used to think the city of Troy was just a myth." She looked me dead in the eye with the nastiest expression I'd ever seen from a high school teacher, and said in a menacing, do not talk back kind of time, "It is a myth." That was my first brush with a teacher who adamantly insisted on an outright falsehood as though it were true. Edit. Actually, I do remember a falsehood I was taught, but the teachers could hardly be blamed for that because the truth was a highly classified secret until around the time I was learning this. Specifically, for years and years, ENIAC, the trajectory calculating computer, was hailed as the first purely electronic, rather than electromechanical computer ever made. This is false. The actual first electronic computer was the Colossus device, which was used to decipher the Lorenz cipher, also known as tunny, because the British code names for various German encryption methods were species of fish. Tunny is an old name for tuna. Without Colossus, it's pretty hard to argue that the European theater of Wappiwiturin would have gone even half as well as it did for the Allies once America joined the effort. But as stated, all of this was highly classified information until around the year 2000, give or take. So it's not that the teachers were perpetuating a lie or a pernicious myth. They were accurately reporting the publicly known history. Story 62. In 2005, I had moved to Oklahoma and attended Tulsa Community College. I took an Oklahoma history course. They taught us about the Tulsa race riot that was caused when a white woman reported that a tried to kiss her, setting off the riots. As we all know, this part of history is now referred to as the Tulsa Race Massacre. Was incredibly disappointed to have learned this information in a college setting. Nothing like paying for misinformation. Story 63. I got in trouble once in geography class in middle school for saying the map was wrong. I'm from South America originally, so was familiar with the size of countries and thought it was weird how huge Greenland and North America were on the big map in class. I even got detention for it, though I was a rebellious kid in general, so I'm sure it was more like a last straw kind of thing. Years later, I see a clip from the show West Wing that went viral talking about this and was so retroactively pissed. Story 64, that the American colonists enthusiastically supported the revolution. Actually, it was so unpopular that Washington resorted to press gang tactics and straight-up kidnapping to fill the ranks of his army. Standard method, get a guy fall down drunk in town, and he wakes up in a military camp. Threaten to hang him as a deserter if he tries to escape. Most colonists didn't give a damn who was in charge. They didn't have enough wealth to be worried about crown taxes and would have just as soon not got shot in a war over the privilege of getting screwed by local elites instead of the king. Story 65. I had an elementary school teacher in the 1960s in NYC, of all places, who taught us that Andrew Johnson was a good man trying to carry on the good intentions of Lincoln, who was thwarted by greedy carpetbaggers in Congress. And that was why relations between the North and South were still contentious a century later. This bullshit was then reinforced by a whole wave of cultural tropes through the 70s that in various ways suggested that the South had been mistreated and prevented by outside forces from growing. In spite of my otherwise progressive political education, that little alternative fact lived on in my memory for decades, and it's only in this century that I finally fully absorbed the much more accurate interpretation that Andrew Johnson was instrumental in betraying Lincoln's legacy, dismantling Reconstruction, and keeping the South in a feudal state while the rest of the world continued growing out of it. Story 66. We have a really good idea what happened to the Roanoke colony. They went to live with a nearby Native American tribe because the colony was running out of supplies and people were starving, cold, and sick. They even wrote where they went on a tree trunk, Croatoan, either reference a nearby tribe or island. Regardless, years later, one of the tribes started having children that obviously had physical European characteristics, which can be a sign of the survivors of the Roanoke colony having an offspring with the people of that tribe. Story 67. Columbus was a heroic explorer who proved the world was round. The end. Never mind that half of that comes from a fictional biography written by Washington Irving. They also skipped all the colonization and genocide and torture and the cutting off of hands and gang rapes and everything else. I got a book in middle school to do a research paper and read the whole story. I asked my teacher if that was real. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and she basically told me, yes, that's real, but we don't talk about it. Story 68. My grade 5 teacher told us Lewis Carroll was a woman who used a male pen name to get published because of prejudice against women in that time period. He wasn't wrong about the ism part, but there were still female authors, artists, academics in that time period, e.g. the Bronte sisters. I learned in high school Lewis Carroll was a man and that he had a side gig as a creepy pedo photographer, which he tried to play off as pre-Raphaelite movement photography art in the 1860s, an excuse to take creepy photos of children. I honestly liked my teacher's lie about Lewis Carroll a lot more than the truth. I kind of prefer that version of Lewis Carroll. Story 69, Christopher Columbus and how he was such a great world traveler and discovered America. He never discovered America. In truth, he was a riddled with STDs and alcoholic, and he landed in the Bahamas. He enslaved and mutilated indigenous peoples. He was arrested by the Spanish government 1499. Several European countries had rejected Columbus for nearly a decade. Columbus lobbied European monarchs to bankroll his expensive quest to discover a western sea route to Asia. In 1484, he tried unsuccessfully to get support from King John II of Portugal, whose experts believed Columbus had underestimated how far he would need to sail. Story 70. Throughout elementary, middle school, and high school, Adam and Eve were presented as historical to me, to the point that our biology teacher taught us that men biologically had one less rib bone than women, which was removed by God to aid in the creation of Eve. This is, of course, not true and 100% whack, but I had to discover that as a very confused 20-year-old taking anatomy classes in college. Went to a very conservative Catholic school. Story 71, this isn't exactly what you asked, but I think it's relevant. One time in history class in the UK, we were studying American politics. A discussion arose about the president, and our teacher asked the class about it. I don't remember exactly what the topic was, but I had an answer. I put up my hand and gave a reasonable answer, which involved mention of the Secret Service. The teacher, who specializes in American history and politics, laughed at me and claimed that the Secret Service doesn't really exist, and he suggested that I had been watching too many action films. As you can imagine, I was completely taken aback by this, especially as I had been advised by the headmaster to be more confident about putting up my hand and asking questions in class. It really felt like a slap in the face. To this day, I cannot understand why he thought the Secret Service is a myth.